Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Today, we are stripping away thousands of years of tradition, ritual, and, well, reference to look at something much more raw.
Yeah, the actual mechanics of belief.
And we're not just, talking about history today.
No, this is a confrontation. It's the ultimate title fight, really. The concept of God versus the core arguments of atheism. And to guide us, we are looking at a really fascinating and, frankly, a pretty provocative source.
The Meek and the Militant, Religion and Power Across the World by Paul N. Siegel.
Right.
And it's a text that forces you to look at religion through a very, very specific lens, not as a mystical truth dropped from the sky, but as a social tool.
A tool that's been used to, pacify the masses, but also, and this is the surprising part, to incite revolution.
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we're going to explore the arguments against a first cause. We're going to trace how the Bible's deity evolves from a tribal war god into a universal spirit.
And we'll get into the materialist view that religion is basically humanity just projecting its own lack of control onto the heavens.
Yeah. It's a heavy agenda, but where we have to start is with the Enlightenment. This is where the intellectual armor of religion really started to get dented.
By thinkers like Holbach and Diderot, the French materialists.
The very same, that they're sort of the intellectual ancestors of the Marxist view on religion.
And they did not pull any punches.
Mm.
One of the biggest things they went after was the argument from design. I feel like everyone knows this one, the watchmaker analogy.
Oh, absolutely. It's the classic apologetic argument. If you're walking in a desert and you find a watch.
You see the gears, the springs, the complexity.
Yeah.
You just assume there was a watchmaker.
You never assume the wind and sand just, came together to form a working timepiece. So the logic follows.
The universe is infinitely more complex than a watch. Therefore, the universe must have had a designer. It feels like common sense.
It does feel intuitive. But our source, referencing Holbach, just tears this apart. Holbach argues that the analogy is, well, it's a category error because it relies entirely on previous experience. We infer a watchmaker because we've all seen people making things. We know what manufactured looks like.
But we've never seen a god make a universe.
Exactly. We have no frame of reference for universe making.
That's a really sharp distinction. We're taking human manufacturing like I built this table and trying to apply it to the cosmos, which operates on completely different principles.
Precisely. Holbach suggests that matter, just governed by its own internal laws of physics and chemistry, is enough to explain the universe. You don't need a supernatural supervisor.
Okay, before we get into the even thornier issue of the first cause, I just wanted to take a quick moment to say, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us out.
So yeah, speaking of that first cause, this is the other pillar the materialists attacked.
The idea that everything needs a cause, so the universe must have a creator to start the whole chain reaction.
But the materialist asks the obvious follow-up question.
If everything requires a creator, then who created the creator?
It's the infinite regress problem. It's turtles all the way down.
Right. And the usual religious argument is, well, God is the exception. God is uncreated.
And the materialist response is just so simple. If you're willing to accept that something can be eternal and uncreated, why can't that something be the universe itself?
Why add the extra step of a deity?
You're just applying a special rule to God that you refuse to apply to matter.
Now, Siegel doesn't just stay in abstract philosophy. He looks at the supervisor, described in the Old Testament. And, well, the Enlightenment thinkers found him wanting.
To put it mildly, they didn't see a loving father, they saw a tyrant. Siegel's text really highlights this critique of Yahweh.
The philosophers pointed out that if you judge this God by human moral standards,
he comes across as incredibly cruel.
There are some jarring examples in the source. I mean, take the story of Elisha. I remember reading this and thinking, wait, is this actually in the Bible?
It is. 2 Kings. The prophet Elisha is walking down the road, and some kids start mocking him. They call him bald head.
A petty insult. Kids being kids.
Right. And what's the divine response? God doesn't teach them a lesson or scare them. He sends 2 bears out of the woods to maul 42 of the children.
By calling a guy bald.
It's a wildly disproportionate response. The text uses this to show that the God of the Bible often acts like an absolute monarch, demanding total respect and punishing any slight with extreme violence.
There's another example that's even darker. The campaign against the Midianites in the book of Numbers.
Oh, yes.
God commands them to kill all the men, but then Moses gets angry that they spared the women, so he orders them to kill all the women who aren't virgins, but to keep the young virgin girls for themselves.
Thomas Paine called this divinely sanctioned brutality. He basically asked, how is this God's word? It looks a lot more like an invading army justifying war crimes with theology.
God told us we could take your land and your daughters. It really challenges that Sunday school version of events.
And this leads us right to the ultimate logical trap for theism, the problem of evil.
This is the big one. If God is all-powerful and all good, why does evil exist?
The usual answer is, God works in mysterious ways, or he uses suffering to bring about a greater good.
Test of faith.
But the text argues that answer reveals a limitation. If God has to use evil to achieve good, he isn't all-powerful. An all-powerful being could just achieve the good result without the evil.
And if he can do it without evil but chooses not to,
then he's not all good. It's a checkmate.
That is a fascinating corner to be painted into. But let's shift gears. We've looked at the philosophical attacks on if God exists. Now, let's look at why humans invented God in the first place.
This moves us from philosophy to sociology. Our source suggests the roots of belief lie in a very early human experience.
And that is dreams.
Dreams? That seems random.
Not if you're an early human. Think about it. You don't understand neurochemistry. One night, you fall asleep, and suddenly you're hunting with your father. You talk to him. Except your father is dead. His body is buried outside the cave.
So you have a contradiction. My senses say I saw him, but my eyes say his body is right there, not moving. Exactly. So how do you resolve that? You assume there's a part of him that's not the body, a double, a soul. The source suggests this is the birth of the spirit world.
So belief starts as a way to explain this nightly experience, but it grows into something else. The text talks about fear and control.
Right. Religion arises from humanity's helplessness. First, against nature, floods, lightning, disease. You can't stop a storm, so you try to bribe the storm spirit with a sacrifice.
It's a transaction. I give you a goat, you don't destroy my hut.
But later, as society advances, we trade helplessness against nature for helplessness against social forces. Wars, market crashes, poverty. We can't control the king, so we project a higher power who can.
And you can see this evolution so clearly in the history of the Jewish God, Yahweh. The sources breakdown of this is wild.
Yeah, Yahweh didn't start as the one true God of the universe. Not at all.
He was a tribal god, right? A mix of things.
An amalgamation. A storm god, a war god, a mountain god. He was local. The early Israelites were henotheists.
Let's unpack that term.
It means they didn't deny other gods existed. They just thought their god was the one they should worship and that he was stronger than the neighbor's gods.
My dad can beat up your dad, but for deities.
Essentially. But then comes the turning point. The Babylonian exile.
When the Jews were conquered and dragged off to Babylon.
Right, and this created a massive theological crisis. If your god is a local war god and you lose the war...
your god looks pretty weak, he lost.
Plus, the Babylonians had these magnificent statues of their gods. The Jews had no technology for that. Their temple was gone.
So by all logic, their religion should die out.
But they pivot. They develop an abstract, universal God. They say, our God doesn't have a statue because he is everywhere. He isn't defeated. He allowed this to happen to punish us.
You shift from my God is strongest to only my God actually exists.
That is a brilliant survival strategy. You turn a military defeat into a theological victory. We didn't lose. God is just teaching us a lesson.
And that universalism sets the stage for Christianity. But the source argues Christianity wasn't a clean break either. It had deep connections to pagan mystery religions.
I love this part of the deep dive. We think of the Jesus story as completely unique, right?
Virgin birth, death, resurrection.
But the source points to some striking parallels. Take Mithraism, a popular Roman cult. They practiced baptism. They shared a communal meal of bread and wine.
And they celebrated the rebirth of the sun for
December 25th.
It sounds incredibly familiar.
Or the cult of Osiris in Egypt, where worshippers prayed for resurrection in a way that was very similar to Christian doctrine.
And the early church fathers knew this, didn't they? They didn't deny the similarities.
They couldn't, so they came up with this incredible defense. Justin Martyr claimed that Satan, knowing the future, went back in time to invent these pagan myths before Christ, specifically to confuse people later.
That is quite the argument. The devil planted the evidence before the crime even happened.
It shows how desperate they were to claim uniqueness. But the more important shift in Christianity, according to our source, is political. It's the shift from revolution to pacification.
Because the Jewish idea of a Messiah was not a spiritual figure. He was supposed to be a general.
Exactly. A revolutionary leader who would kick out the Romans and establish a kingdom on earth. Real estate, not clouds. But then 70 AD happens. The Jewish rebellion is crushed. Jerusalem is destroyed.
The revolutionary path failed. Utterly.
Completely. So Christianity adapted. It became the religion of the urban poor, the slaves, and it changed the promise. Since we can't have a kingdom here, the kingdom is not of this world.
And instead of fighting Rome, you get Romans 13.1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers.
Which is the ultimate irony. A religion born from a yearning for liberation becomes the state religion of the oppressor, the Roman Empire under Constantine. It becomes a tool to keep the poor in line by promising them a reward after they die.
Speaking of tools for social control, the deep dive takes us east. It argues that Eastern religions played a very similar game. Let's talk about Hinduism.
The source analyzes the caste system. We often see it as purely religious karma, reincarnation, but Siegel points out its cold, hard economic function.
As a tool for assimilation.
A brilliant one. When the Aryans moved into India, rather than wiping out the local tribes, they just absorbed them. They gave the entire tribe a place in the hierarchy, usually a low caste, sure, but it integrated them. It gave them a stable labor force without constant war.
It's efficient oppression.
Yeah.
And the text mentions the juggernaut.
Yes, the festival of Puri. The massive cart of Vishnu being pulled by thousands. The British told horror stories about people throwing themselves under the wheels.
The text says those deaths were exaggerated, but the metaphor is powerful.
It is. A symbol of the masses being crushed by the sheer weight of religious institutions.
And what about Buddhism? We usually think of it as the peaceful, meditative option.
The source challenges that romanticized view. Historically, Buddhism was very adaptable to power. Monasteries in Japan often served feudal landlords. They were major landowners.
And sometimes they weren't even that peaceful.
Correct. There were eras where monasteries fielded their own armies of warrior monks. They were political players fighting for territory and influence.
So we've seen God as a tyrant, a coping mechanism, and a tool for the status quo. But here is where it gets really interesting. The source argues that in the modern era, religion splits into the meek and the militant.
This is the core dialectic of the book. Let's look at the U.S. context first. The text draws the line from the Puritans to modern American patriotism.
The Puritans saw themselves as the new Israel.
Which had very dark implications. If you're the new Israel, the Native Americans become the Canaanites. And if you know your Bible, you know what happens to the Canaanites.
A theological justification for slaughter.
But today, the source argues American religion is different. It's become almost secularized.
It calls it a Rotary Club ideology.
Right. Specific theological dogma like the Trinity has faded. Instead, religion serves as a vague moral backing for the American way of life. Democracy, free enterprise, being a good neighbor. It's less about fear of hell and more about community cohesion.
It's safe. But then you have the other side of the coin, the militant.
Liberation theology. This is where the Marxist analysis in the source gets really nuanced. It admits that religion isn't always a drug to keep people sleeping.
Sometimes it's a stimulant. We see this in Latin America with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua or figures like Camilo Torres.
The guerrilla priest, a fascinating figure. He famously said that the duty of every Catholic is to be a revolutionary. He literally took up arms.
And this leads to a surprising alliance. Marxists, who are theoretically atheists, teaming up with religious believers.
The text discusses Fidel Castro's view on this. He realized that the strict, dogmatic atheism of early European Marxists just didn't work in Latin America. He argued that a revolutionary can be a believer.
Because the focus shifts. Right.
Exactly. The debate isn't does God exist anymore. The debate is, does God want justice for the poor? And if the answer is yes, then the priest and the revolutionary are fighting the same battle.
That is a crucial distinction. It's not a conspiracy of priests tricking people. It's a language that can be used by the oppressor to say, obey, or by the oppressed to say, rebel.
And that brings us to the synthesis of Siegel's argument.
So what does this all mean for the future of belief?
Well, the source concludes with a classic materialist prediction. It argues humanity invented religion because we are afraid and powerless. We couldn't control nature and we couldn't control our societies.
So logically, if we gain control.
If we gain control through science, through better social organization, the need for the opium just fades. You don't need to ban religion with police. You just create a world where people don't need the comfort of an illusion because their reality isn't miserable anymore.
It's an optimistic view of human potential. But it leaves us with a really provocative thought to chew on.
It does. If we accept the premise that religion was born out of fear and a lack of control, What does the persistence and even the resurgence of religion today tell us?
That is the question. We have iPhones, we have vaccines, we have space travel, but religion is still here. Does that mean we have less control over our modern world than we think we do?
Are we just as scared of the forces, the markets, the wars, the climate as our ancestors were of the thunder?
Perhaps the storm gods haven't gone away, they've just moved to the stock exchange.
And on that note, we'll leave you to think deeper. Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.